It looks like we've got 81 folks that are in the session now. They can hear us. And since everybody's here, I'm going to just go ahead and kick us off. I'm very, very excited for us to be here all today. I have to thank Anda and the team at Notch for thinking about Atlanta in this way, because we are very proud to have amazing marketing and communications leaders in our city. And I think that, look, Douwe is showing you the views. And we're also very proud to have some excellent top-notch well represented here in the region. And so I'm hopeful that this conversation will be one that people will maybe just glean some big takeaways from as it relates to courageous brand leadership. So before, I've got a couple of comments I just wanted to say to kick us off and to set the stage, just as a reminder for people. So before we got to March of 2020, I think a lot of us rolled into the year. It was, it was a great year. Sales were looking good. And, we were like shaking meetings, and if you really liked your colleagues, you might have given them a hug and said hello here and there. And then all of a sudden, March came, and for B, I'm sure it was even January. Maybe you'll get into some of that. So for a global brand, it hit earlier, but for a more local brand, and for some of us locally as employees, we learned in March, I think, that 2020 did not come for weak leaders. It is not the year to be a weak leader, absolutely. And especially in the marketing communication space, I think that is very true as we face a global pandemic. I think also then May came, and sadly, for us here in Atlanta, as systemic racism has become such an important and prevalent topic in our nation, we also had a very tragic and horrific example, more than one actually, in our state of racism on display in just a matter of weeks. And so, we know that in a city and region where we like to call ourselves the Black Mecca, we brag about our diversity. All of these things have affected us as leaders very personally. They've affected our friends and our employees. Companies have responded with statements and commitments and town halls and courageous conversations and Juneteenth and all of these things. And so I am predicting that 2020 will forever be remembered as the year of courageous leadership, and especially the year of courageous brand leadership. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So I will let B and Douwe just jump in. And I'd like, maybe we'll start with you, B, but the question will be for both of you all. Can you give the audience just a quick intro, tell them a little bit about who you are and what you do, but then also if you could speak to what courageous brand leadership has meant to you in this moment. I think folks would be well suited to hear that.
Thank you, Deisha. Well, I want to just quickly, before I talk about myself, I just want to say thank you to Deisha, because Deisha and the Metro Chamber and Deisha's personal leadership in actually keeping the Atlanta community connected is an example of courageous leadership. And so I've been at Coke for 25 years. I've spanned a career from brand management. I was the chief marketing officer for North American business. I became then Coke's first chief sustainability officer and reshaped that direction in terms of integration into the business. I still retain that role, as well as I've taken on other responsibilities. I'm our chief communications officer, as well as our chief officer for marketing assets, all the sponsorship, sports, entertainment, media. So where the brands come to life. And the way that I think about courageous leadership is, what do you stand for? Do people actually know what you stand for? And will you stand for what's right, even if it poses risk for your business or for yourself? And, I love history. I actually also oversee the archives at Coke. And I wasn't there then, I'm not that old, but in 1964. So in 1964, I'll say this for me is an example of courageous leadership. And I can give other examples, but this one I think is relevant to the situation and the time that society is in today. It was when Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And it was when the mayor of Atlanta, Mayor Ivan Allen, wanted to host a dinner and invited people to come to the dinner, to the Atlanta community, the business community, society, other world leaders. and no one was responding. Not the white business community was the one actually not responding. And what happened is the mayor came, because it was a city dinner, the mayor came to Robert Woodruff at Coca-Cola and he said, I'm not sure what is actually going on here, but maybe could you help us to talk to the other leaders? Because Robert Woodruff had quite a presence in Atlanta at the time. And he quickly stood up and said, absolutely, and put in charge Paul Austin, our CEO at the time, and said, you go and tell the other city CEOs of Atlanta's business community that, you know what, if they don't show up to this dinner, then it shows that Coca-Cola really doesn't need Atlanta, and Atlanta must not want Coca-Cola here, because we're going to leave this city if this business community does not stand up and support this community and does what's right. And it'll be the business who pays the price and the economics. And it was quite a, there's different quotes. And so, I'm not quoting it exactly, but what I will tell you is everyone got the gist. And it was interesting because over 1,600 people within 24 hours of those public statements and those sessions came together and rallied behind it, and it was sold out. And, people like Ambassador Young, who, had spent a lot of time with Coca-Cola at the time, actually helped support Coke as well to really garner and bring the communities together. So between Robert Woodruff, Paul Austin, and really Ambassador Young got the communities connected. And it was quite an amazing celebration. And that, took, a lot of, I'd say, putting yourself out there, because at the time there were no business leaders standing up for those types of issues and for saying, come on, we're going to leave this city and we're not going to participate in business with you all if this is not properly celebrated. And so those are the kinds of things when I look at courageous leadership, is what risk is your brand or your company willing to take to do what's right? And, sometimes it doesn't always work out and brands aren't perfect, but at the end of the day, you have to stand for something. And if people aren't clear what you stand for, then I'm not sure I could say it's a courageous leader or a courageous brand.
Thank you so much, Rick. And that's right. Those are phrases and words for us to think about, I think, right now. So Douwe, why don't you jump in here and give your perspective, but also tell people a little bit about what you do at Piedmont. And I think they'd also be interested in your background with Georgia Pacific and some of the other things that you've done in your career.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for including us and including me, and especially thanking you for pairing me up with the two of you. Because let's be clear, the 96 people that joined this session probably came for Bia and Deisha, not so much for Douwe. But that's one of the benefits of being in Atlanta, is when you get paired up with Coca-Cola, you're guaranteed a crowd. So hello, everybody. I'll take the opportunity to introduce Piedmont Healthcare to you. Piedmont Healthcare is the largest healthcare system in the state of Georgia. We treat about 2.7 million patients every year. We have 11 hospitals. One hospital is Piedmont Atlanta, which is the origin of our brand that started 110 years ago. And we mainly treat the Coca-Cola employees, basically, as well as Delta, UPS, Home Depot. Many of the large companies in the city of Atlanta and the state of Georgia are patients of Piedmont Healthcare. And Piedmont Healthcare has expanded over those 110 years. We're now all over the state. We cover about 70% of people in the state of Georgia. And we have about 800 offices, which includes primary care, urgent care, quick care, et cetera, et cetera. So basically a large healthcare system. A little bit about me. I started at Procter & Gamble in the Netherlands many, many years ago. That explains my weird name as well as my accent. Procter sent me to Atlanta back in '99 to do a broadening assignment in sales. The 2-year assignment in Atlanta became a 13-year assignment in Cincinnati, Ohio. P&G always joked, always leads to Cincinnati, whether you like it or not. I had a fantastic time in Cincinnati. But about 9 years ago, it's probably longer, in 2011, I had a great opportunity to become the first chief marketing officer at Georgia Pacific here in Atlanta, Georgia. So I moved back from Cincinnati to Atlanta and took the role at Georgia Pacific, where I was the chief marketing officer for 9 years over all of their consumer products and all capabilities, excluding communication, Bia. And then in February, probably 4 months ago, I started here at Piedmont Healthcare, overseeing all external and internal communications. Would love to talk to Bia about how to do that. And overseeing all physicians outreach, which is the healthcare version of sales. And of course marketing, which is kind of the main reason that I joined or that they hired me. So that's kind of the background. So 3 employees, Procter & Gamble, Georgia Pacific, and now Piedmont Healthcare. Obviously, after 25 years in CPG, now I'm like 100 days in healthcare, which is a fantastic change of almost anything. And happy to talk about that more any other day. I'm sure I'll run into Pia and Deisha once we are getting out of our offices or out of our homes and start interacting again. The next question was, what is courageous? And I agree with what Bia has said, and that has been a big part of the majority of my career to date, as I've worked in CPG with companies like Coca-Cola and direct to consumer brands, CPG brands, and where the connection with your consumers is mostly driven through the communications that you have, and then your product experience is mostly driven through the retailers that you sell to. Having joined healthcare a few months ago, I got a bit of a different perspective on what courageous also means. And it's more about doing and then saying what you do or not. And it's less about saying and not doing. And Coca-Cola is a beautiful company that does both, right? They have the power of the word. They're one of the largest and most famous advertisers, and they do a lot. And they have a strong heritage, which provides them the right to say things and actually do things. But there's a lot of companies, not to be named out there, that do a lot of saying and little doing. At one point, being in healthcare and in my 5th week, Corona hit, you actually get a complete different meaning of what doing, a complete different perspective of what doing actually means. Courageous in our world meant that people rolled up their sleeves and drove to the hospital, away from their homes, away from their families, not knowing where to put their kids, not knowing what to do because they had to save people. Literally rolling up their sleeves, saving lives, not knowing if their kids would be fine. Courageous means that we opened up childcare in our hospitals overnight with the donations of a lot of companies like Coca-Cola, Home Depot, Chick-fil-A, individual families, Rooms to Go, and Aflac, big donors. Courageous means opening a hospital that had been closed for many, many years, and it was just sitting there. Courageous means pulling forward the opening of our tower here in Buckhead with 4 or 5 months, working with the governor as well as the mayor of Atlanta, saying, hey, listen, we need all these permissions to run through really fast so we can significantly expand our COVID capacity for the state. And I can go on and on. And it has been very heartwarming, and obviously I'm not a frontline worker, let's be clear about that, to see the response we got from the community, churches spraying on our parking lots, big and small companies donating, whether it was just a lunchbox or donating millions of dollars so that we can manage our childcare or get vans or masks. That's what courage has meant for us. And it's also has meant for our employees on the front line. The last thing I would say, it's not a secret that the healthcare industry and the healthcare systems had an enormous impact on their top line revenue, like many other companies. But for us, it's this double whammy where we say you had to run to the front line to take care of patients that did not know what to do. And our hospitals were flooded with a lot of COVID patients, obviously. And on the other hand, you went through the worst financial performance in history. And so courage now is everybody taking a salary cut, every time they're taking unpaid leaves, everybody rolling up their sleeves to say, while we're still taking care of all these COVID patients, how do we turn this around and make sure that we continue to exist? And it has been amazing to see how people are rolling up their sleeves, stepping it up, while our salary cuts have been anywhere between 5 and 25%, like many other healthcare systems. Many of our folks moved to 4-day work weeks where they had one on the unpaid leave. Some of our colleagues in town had to furlough thousands and hundreds of people. And courage means to stay focused while that's going all around you and saying, listen, I still have a job to do. I still need to take care of these patients, and I still make sure that I'm responsible with the assets. And that responsibility has increased tremendously because we're a nonprofit. We did receive government help through the CARE Act. We did receive a lot of donations, which makes you very aware that you have to be extremely responsible, a good steward of these finances and the assets that have been given to you. I know the answer was longer than the 2 minutes that you briefed it on, Deisha, but that was courageous.
That was great. Now, I think those of us who have time in public probably said on more than one occasion that it's PR and not the ER. But in your case, it is the ER. And it does take a lot of courage. I think that all of us have honored the frontline workers in our hospitals, in particular, this day and age. I mean, it is life or death for so many people in this country. So thank you, and thank Piedmont for your service. And I think what you speak to, it actually, sort of, I hope, makes everybody realize how important, or in some cases unimportant, some of the work that we are doing is, because some of us are actually out here saving lives. So thank you. What I will say next,
I'm not part of the front line.
But your colleagues are, and I have to believe that what you're doing to communicate to your employees and to your customers has been critical in this moment. And maybe we'll have a chance to hear from you on that here soon. But I was going to switch back to B. B, you stole my story, because I love to talk about the MLK Nobel Peace Prize moment for Atlanta. And as I'm told, I always say that Coca-Cola put its giant corporate foot down, and eventually the thing sold out, and white executives held hands and saying, "We shall overcome." Yes. That's the part that I like to get to. So I think that in that spirit, I took a minute to read the statement that Coca-Cola put out related to all of the conversation around race that's happening. And I wanted to ask you, in the statement, you all talk about your duty to Black people in America. And I was hoping you might just expound a bit on that, share, give us a little peek under the hood, share with us, sort of how you all got to that sort of language, and how you view some of the biggest challenges or opportunities for Coke in this moment.
Yes, thanks, Deisha. Well, I will tell you that this is a time where our chairman and CEO took real personal accountability here as well. And so, as his comms person, I'd like to take credit for that language, but I really can't. It was James, when he started to see what had happened, and he's actually working remotely from London because, as you probably know, that he has not been able to get his visa to return yet. So he's still stuck there. But we were talking, and he said, what has happened? Because the London news was covering it very differently. And so I read him different statements from our employees. And we had a discussion around, there are going to be a lot of people who want you to talk about inclusivity and broaden this to a discussion around multicultural, to how do we think about everything, not just Blacks, but they're going to want to expand this to include all other groups. And right now, the issue we're talking about, and we got very laser focused based on employee feedback, was this issue that we're talking about at hand is about deep-seated racism, systemic racism against Blacks and against Black males in particular in many cases, but against Blacks. And how do we think about managing and discussing discussing the role and the accountability we have as a company and what we can do to help. While of course we're an inclusive company and we do, look at what are the other issues facing other groups, but in this case, we have to take real ownership here and address the issue at hand. And James wanted to take an inside-out approach. He wanted to listen more to the employees and hear what the employees were saying. He made a public statement, but he first held listening sessions. And what some people don't know is he actually met very, personally with several employees, but then he had a global town hall. And when he talked about the actions he wanted to take, he really felt that we have an accountability to change and shape policies, to advocate, but he broke it into 4 buckets. He said, number one, we have to listen. We have to listen to you all as our associates and understand what is happening. And is this a U.S. issue? Is this a global issue? Is this deep-rooted systemic racism? What can we do to change it? And how should we think about this as a business, as a brand? And then also listen to key stakeholders. And so, as you know, Deisha, the Metro Chamber's been holding a weekly session. I can tell you that he's listening in personally to some of your sessions. And he's really been building his brain. And so listening was really, really important, but starting with our own employees, because, I'll be frank, we've not been perfect. So while we have that great story of Martin Luther King, we also in 1999 had a lawsuit by our Black employees. And we have to own that. We made progress from there, and we certainly have a lot to be proud of. But the reality is have we done enough? Is there more we can do? And so listening was number one. And then leading. So if we've made progress ourselves, how did we do it? How did we advance Black employees to leadership roles? How did we get a good percentage of our population to actually exceed the population of the US or of the areas that we operate in? How did we do it? And what else has to be done, both internally and externally? And lead across the world as well. And I'll talk about that towards the end, as well as then invest. So we have to put our money where our voice is. We have to make sure that the dollars match. And while we've done really strong investments to the NAACP, to 100 Black men, we've done several different donations, that's not enough. There actually has to be more fundamental change and investment in terms of how much are we spending with our supplier diversity program with the Black community. So with diversity spends, we know we have a commitment to get to over $1 billion. We're already at 800 million. That was publicly reported already last April. But the reality is how much of that is going to Black businesses. And so we've got to do the click down and really look at that. And how can we make sure that we're investing in people, training? How do we make sure that we understand that if there's microaggressions or systemic racism, that we can help to invest to drive that change? And then the last piece is advocate. How do we advocate for change? And so a couple examples is probably many of you know that Georgia was one of the 4 states that did not have a hate crimes bill. Unheard of, right? But it didn't. I know the Metro Chamber was advocating to rally business behind this as well. Well, we had our head of North America, Jim Dinkins, write a letter to the governor, lieutenant governor, to the Speaker of the House, but also what was fascinating too is from the listening discussions, we had a group of employees who wanted to self-organize a march to be able to support and to write letters themselves to get this legislation enacted. And we saw hundreds and hundreds of employees take this initiative. We supported them. We gave access to parking. We handed out the masks. We made sure that people understood that there's still a pandemic here. So, writing letters was okay if you weren't able to get out and do the march. But, made sure you're safe. And we made sure sort of the routes and everything were clear on where they could walk. But it was interesting because the employees were really on the edge of their seat the other day to see what was going to happen when it got voted in. And so the employees also helped to shape this in terms of their voices being heard, but also in partnership with the business, with the letter writing, with the conversations with different government officials to enact this policy. And that's just one example of it. But we have to continue to advocate and use the brand voice. You talked a little bit about the brand voice and the power of the brand. So we have now also moved in. If you go on our social media, you'll see not only did we make statements, we're making investments there, but also we're advocating to help support Black businesses, Black creative areas. And if you look at, it's not just Coca-Cola, it's also our Sprite brand. And so you can learn a little bit more, but we're trying to make sure that we're listening to the folks who can guide us best. Most of those are our employees as well as our business partners and folks within the community. but also trying to make sure that we're matching the voice with the spend. And so it's really listening, it's leading and setting the goals, making sure we're measuring, tracking that. We're having conversations throughout all levels of the organization, including, by the way, when we saw the protest in solidarity around the world, we had listening sessions with our employees from the Netherlands, from our ASEAN business units. I mean, all around the world. I can tell you, South Africa, we had a session today, a global town hall, where our South African business actually shared what was it like during apartheid and what happened to society, what happened to the economies, and how was the rebuilding or building afterwards, and what policies and things really needed to fundamentally change. And so it's that constant dialogue of tapping into people, but also tapping into other examples where we can get some key learnings and using the power of the brand and power of the people, but also making sure that we're acknowledging what the real problem is. Because, and I listened to one of the earlier sessions today, the movement, and there were several people who talked a lot about being very careful that there was an example used where there was a company that was not Black owned that was using Juneteenth as sort of a coupon code. And that was literally taking advantage of the moment versus truly trying to drive change in the movement. And when I heard her speak about this, the panelist, I thought, that's a really important point here. We have to make sure that while a lot of people want to help, because I think a lot of this happens from good intent and people who really want to help out and want to stand by communities and support them, we also have to be very thoughtful, make sure we're asking ourselves the right questions, which is, do we legitimately have a space within this area? And do we talk or do we act? Do we do both? How much are we willing to invest? Are we willing to actually have a position in our business that puts risk and costs money in order to do the right thing? Which, of course, that goes back to another session I heard later on in terms of purpose. And so it's grounded in, does your brand, does your company have purpose and values, and do you live by them? And so I've kind of gone down a road, but I wanted you to know that it wasn't just a statement on a website that we made. It was actually a series of conversations. It was informed by our employees, informed, Deisha, frankly, by people like you who've held the sessions with the Metro Chamber and other speakers. And it's been informed by our CEO directly, who said, enough is enough. We have to act here, and we have to make sure we're doing the right things. And frankly, if we're not doing everything, in our business that we can, then we fail. We fail as a business if we're not doing more. And of course, acknowledging our own history and that we're not perfect. We might have some great examples, but we also have some bad examples too. So we have to really own the good and the bad.
That's right. I hear a mix of things from you, B. Authenticity is one of the things that I'm hearing, that the brand has to continue to be authentic and honest. And honesty is also about owning up when you've made mistakes. And I think listening in this moment has been just important for individuals, and important for leaders, and then also important at a corporate level. And that I'm very passionate about this idea that companies can use their size and scale for good in our society, in our global society. So I'm just always very proud to hear a little peek under the hood from you. So Douwe, let's come back to you for a moment. And I will encourage the 72 people listening. Wait, it just went up one. Please, if you have questions, go ahead and start to enter them in the chat. We're going to try to turn over for questions here in a moment. But my last question is going to be for Douwe. I think it's so appropriate that we've got a healthcare company and brand represented here. So if you could tell us a little bit more in specificity about the role that your marketing communications team is playing in navigating this pandemic here locally for your company and for our community more broadly. If you could just share a little bit.
Thanks for the question, and the wonderful things that Coke is doing, and we're happy that Piedmont was also underwriting and supporting the passing of the bill. I think we started out with 60 companies here, and I think we're over 100 or maybe 200. Deisha, you would know better. But if you look at the role of marketing during this first crisis, because basically we have multiple things going on. One was the COVID response, which obviously is our core business in healthcare. If we don't respond, who will? The second was the business recovery. So how do we lose a lot of revenue and make that up as quick as possible while still responding to COVID? And so that was the kind of the third one is the financial challenge that we have. So you do number 1 and 2 while you're cutting costs and sending people home, so you have less resources. And then the fourth one is what we all are facing is all the racial injustice that was happening in society and that is impacting. Keep in mind that about 47% of our workforce are people of color and have a diverse background, and 80% of our workforce are women. So our numbers for our healthcare are very different than, if you would say, like average companies in America or around the world. If you look at that, marketing played a role in all of those. And in our world, marketing, internal and external communications, as well as sales, are all combined in one organization. And things shifted significantly. As the COVID started, we started to do less marketing in the traditional sense of the word and more communications. Especially when the CDC was updating their guidelines almost every other day. You have to make sure that your 23,000 employees know what the latest and greatest is. Do you wear a mask or not? And if you don't wear a mask, which of the masks are you wearing when? Very important for a hospital. And reality was that there was not sufficiency of masks for everybody. So while people in society were not wearing masks, they did that so that people in the hospitals could get the masks. And that later changed. One example, like how do you make sure that your internal communication is up to speed while at the same time you're informing millions of potential patients and the community about what the rules and regulations are? What is the visitors policy? What are the masks? Can you come in or not? So if you come in, what do you need to do? We've all lived through it, but as a healthcare system, it's very important that you inform your own employees internally, which surprisingly was a large challenge because everybody on the front line is so focused on helping patients. They don't have time to check their cell phones. They don't have time to check email, which is the main way of communicating to people nowadays. So it was a very interesting challenge, especially in the first few weeks. Marketing played a key role. Marketing communication played a key role, making sure that all our employees were up to speed by checking what was outside in the world and then making sure anybody internally and then informing your patients. At the same time, there was this huge demand in press requests. They wanted to know, like, what are you going to do about this? Hey, the CDC changed. What are you guys doing? Hey, we just talked to Emory and Northside. They're doing A. Why are you doing B? Oh, I didn't know they were doing A. Maybe I need to call Emory. What are we doing? One of the things that also happened, which I thought was amazing, is that the biggest competitors in the marketplace started collaborating very closely to make sure that nobody dropped the ball and that we would all make sure that whatever happened, we saved patients first. So imagine Pepsi and Coca-Cola working together on something. They say, listen, this is so much bigger than any of us. We need to collaborate. So Emory, which is the number 2 system in Georgia, Northside, Wellstar, Children's Hospital, they all started working together and almost have daily calls. What are your supplies? What is your demand? Where are you hurting? Where are you going? Our doctors started exchanging. What are you seeing in COVID? What are the symptoms? What is working? What's not working? Our procurement people were talking together, but also the marketing and communication people working together to make sure that we don't have confusing visitor policies, that we don't have different things you normally would compete on and try to differentiate. We try to make sure that our patients and our community that we all serve were helped first and foremost. So that was another role, making sure that we have that combination. And then in the recovery, it's kind of similar to what you normally do. Who do you get back? And through all of this, I would say the number 1 priority was listening and understanding. Basically, what they also said, it's not only listening and understanding your employees, but also your consumers and your patients. What are they worried about? I can talk about masks, but if they're worried mostly about being close to another COVID patient, then I need to address social distancing more than wearing a mask. Or if they're worried about, can I bring my mom in, or can I accompany my mom? Is she going in? How many visitors are allowed? So you need to listen what are the concerns and what are the worries. Make sure that you educate people. One of the biggest concerns that we have right now is people are avoiding visiting the hospital, even though they sense they have issues with their heart, which basically means, I don't want to be blunt, but basically means that people had heart attacks they didn't need to have, that could have been saved, but they were so afraid of COVID that they had a heart attack that was fatal. And that's just disheartening. So how do you educate people? Like, listen, take the care that you need to have, and we'll make sure that you're as safe as possible. You know, this is what we're doing, but don't pass on necessarily healthcare because you're afraid of COVID. And listening and understanding, that is key. So understanding and listening to your employees and to your community, and then making sure you inform your employees first and foremost, because they are the spokesperson to your patients the majority of the time. And then informing the community about what's going on, and then listen again. Those were kind of, and it's kind of the role of marketing and communication in general. But what I noticed during COVID is everything gets accelerated and everything gets amplified. Yes. And if it works, great, you know, it works to your advantage. If it doesn't work, it gets accelerated and it gets amplified to the negative. And so you had to course correct. So agility was actually a huge part of what we've done.
Yes, and that's actually been a conversation, I think, earlier in one of the panels today that I was listening to. So I am very conscious of time. We are over time. My last rapid fire to wrap it up, when we're talking about, you know, these topics that are pretty heavy right now. So B and Douwe, I'm gonna start with you, B, but the question is, what are you saying to your teams? And what do you say to the people who are listening to inspire them to continue being courageous in this moment?
So I once had a mentor, and I will say that, you know, incredible human being, who said to me, because I used to get very nervous about always having a different point of view or speaking up in the beginning. And he said to me, he said, you know what, if everyone in the room agrees with you, then probably you're the problem. He said, if you're not pushing the room enough, and if you're not being courageous enough in the room where people want to give a counterpoint of view or fight back a little bit, then you probably are not doing enough to drive change and to move people in the right direction. And he said, that's really when it's time to reflect on what's your personal value system and what's your purpose and your objective of being in a company or in the room. And so the other question I always ask my employees to say is, ask yourself, what would not happen if you were not there? What would not happen if you were not there? Meaning, would Coca-Cola have written those letters to support the hate crime legislation if some of the employees hadn't raised their voices and said enough is enough? What would not happen? And so I think it's important to push ourselves to be uncomfortable and to drive the change that we have an accountability as big businesses, as big brands who employ a lot of people and who are frankly rewarded by those consumers who open up their wallets and spend money with us day in and day out. How do we contribute to society, and how do we use our brands and our voices to drive that change? And so to my teams, I always ask them, ask yourself, are you pushing enough? Are you truly living the values and the purpose that, you know, you set out to live? And is it in line with the company value and purposes? Are the company value and purposes the right ones? And what would not happen if you weren't in the room? Or are you simply just a bystander in the room taking in information, but not driving the change that you personally in your heart of all hearts want to drive change? So speak up, be courageous, and truly push and try to figure out what are you sort of doing in that room, and are you making that difference?
Yes, hear to that. So Douwe, what are you saying to your teams right now?
Obviously, I use more words, but the gist is the following, and it's an oldie from Stephen Covey and the 7 Habits. But the one thing I impress on everybody is seek first to understand before to be understood. And that's kind of what Bia has been saying as well, right before you come out, is like, how do you listen before you talk? And we have a very diverse population, diverse as racial background, sex, but also age. Also back up how you grew up. Georgia can be very polarizing, from like downtown Atlanta to the start of the Appalachian Mountains, and it's all Georgia, and so it can be extremely polarizing when it comes down to race, as history has shown. And so for me, it's important that everybody just first and foremost listens. But it can only happen if people are brave enough to speak up. And we started a whole series led by our HR and our new D&I leader, Joanne Hill, a whole series of how do you structure these conversations, like, and how do you make sure that people have that dialogue. And a dialogue, which is a very uncomfortable dialogue. And it's kind of interesting because it's all business typically, and people have the conversation with their friends, and all of a sudden you need to open up, and then you start with a topic that is this tough, and is this deep-rooted, and has this much history in Georgia. It's like, hey, let's open up, and then this is the topic we're talking about. But we've seen tremendous responses. And people are literally learning from, I had no understanding, or I had no idea this is the life you've lived. But the reverse is also true. I had no idea that you were that you lacked so much knowledge, or that you didn't understand what life is about because you lived in a different area, a suburb, or up in the country, et cetera, et cetera. So it's triggered a good conversation on this specific topic, which actually leads to more conversations among other topics and just human to human interaction rather than colleague to colleague. I'll leave it at that.
Good. Well, thank you both. And thanks to the team at Notch for having us. Courageous leadership is necessary for sure in this moment. So hopefully everybody took a few nuggets away. I appreciate you guys. Atlanta is lucky to have you all.
Same for you. Thank you, Deisha. We're lucky to have you.
Bye.
Yes, we're